Welcome back everyone to the React In-Depth series. In this video, we're going to go over the final major hook, finally, that we've been waiting for this entire series, and that is the useContext hook. Now, this hook is a little bit less used, although probably more increasingly these days, and I'll mention a lot of use cases throughout this video. And if you're probably thinking, hey, Netter, like I've heard that there's many more different hooks out there, like use memo and use callback and use ID and all these different ones. I'll probably cover those in future more advanced videos because the likelihood and chances of us reaching out for those hooks are very, very niche and very specific, and unlikely that we will be using them kind of like day to day, like these major hooks that we're going for, even something like useContext. So context is going to allow us to actually store information and pass it throughout our React trees in a much easier way as a nice alternative to prop drilling. And it gives us some really nice kind of API and toolchain to actually work with that. And we can actually combine it with really awesome other hooks like useState as well as useReducer to kind of make our own like mini Redux style state management. So let's take a look at kind of how this all works in the video together. Okay, so to start, I just want to start with an overview of what this useContext hook is, right? So this is just another React hook. It comes built into React, and we can just import it from the React library. But it really is helps us end this whole idea of prop drilling. So if this idea of prop drilling is new to you, I encourage you to check out the video on the channel on the same series on props and prop drilling as well. We have some examples on that, and we kind of go through like kind of where it kind of gets a bit tricky and it might cause some issues potentially in our application if things get too nested. So context is really a hook that allows us to share data with all the children in a subtree from a particular component. Okay. Now, traditionally what you'll see is that this is used in conjunction with something like useState to make this state stateful. There's a lot of state in one sentence there, but we'll see kind of what I mean by that shortly. And it can even be combined with other state like useReducer, which we saw in the previous video as well. But by default, it is not stateful, and we can actually share data in like a non-stateful way. In some cases, that is very useful as well. So let's take a look at kind of what this useContext is and the steps to set this up, and kind of go through kind of all this so by the end of this video, we have a good understanding of what this all means. So there are really these main steps to start creating a context in React and sharing it with our tree of components. I'm going to switch over to VS Code and start a project for React, and then I'm going to come back here and we're going to do these steps one at a time just so I can let that run. So I have a folder open here. I'm just going to open up my terminal, and just like all our other videos, I'm going to run npm create. We're going to use vite at React, and vite at React is not what I wanted. I'm going to run npm create vite at latest. You see, sometimes you get too excited about specific tools and technologies, and then you forget what you're typing. I'm going to run useContext for my project name here. I'm going to run React and JavaScript, and then I'm going to cd into my useContext folder, run npm install. I'll let that go on in the background, and I'll open up this folder. Just like before, we have our main JSX file, and then we have our app JSX file. I'm going to ignore the app JSX file for now. We're actually going to create our own tree of components and see how we can share some state values between those. So if I switch back here, let's take a look at this. So we want to, step one, create a new context with create context. So what does this mean? So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to set this tree up really quick. I'm going to run npm run dev here, just so that the server can run. And then I have my URL over here. I'll just copy that over, switch to Chrome, create a new window, and grab my localhost URL and zoom in a lot so that we can see all this in a nice big detail. There we go. Okay, so if I switch back to React, I'm going to make 3 different components here. And this is how I want to demo context for the rest of this video so that we have a nice starting point. I'll just close my terminal here. I'll also get rid of this index styling CSS file, so we just have the base stuff so we don't have to deal with any extra stuff. I'm going to create a 3 different files. Okay, I'm going to create a level3.jsx file. And I'm going to copy that a few times, and I'm going to do a level2.jsx file and a level1.jsx file. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of see if we can pass props down these levels, starting with kind of the grandfather and then the parent, grandparent, parent, and child kind of relationship here. So in this level 3, what I'll do is I'll create a function. I'll call this level 3, and I will export default level 3, and I'll just return in this one an h1, and it just is going to say level 3, right? I'm actually going to copy this over, so I'm going to Control A, Control C, switch over to level 2, paste that in. I'm going to switch this to level 2 here, level 2 here, and then level 2 there. And I'll do the same for level 1 here, level 1 here, and level 1 here. Perfect. What I should probably do is switch these instead of being like H1 is all over the place. I'll probably do like this is an H1. This is kind of in reverse, I guess. So this is a bit confusing. So I'll probably leave that as an H1. I'll do an H2 here for level 2. It doesn't really matter. This is just to make it look a little bit better. And then H3 for level 1. It's kind of in reverse because we're going down the tree. If you want to switch this around, it's up to you. It doesn't really matter as long as we have 3 levels. So my goal is to make level 3 the top level component. Okay, so what I didn't include here in my slides is that we want to create this context in the place that we want it to live at the highest level in the tree that it should be. And we'll see kind of why this is important later on, but let's just start with that concept for now. We're going to see that step. Then what we're going to do is we're going to pass in our values and state that we want to share. And this can be any type of state that we want, either like a set state, a useState, a useReducer state, or just not state at all in the context of actually re-rendering state, just like an object that we want to share around. Very similar actually to something like useRef, just some data that we want to be able to share throughout our React tree without actually having to pass it down constantly as props. We're going to create something called a context provider. We're going to tell it what values we want, and then we're going to consume that context through a consumer child component using this new hook that we're about to learn, which is the useContext hook. Okay, so let's do these one step at a time. We're going to create a context with this create context function, which comes from React, and that's going to give us a context object. So let's see what that looks like. So I'm going to create my context in this level 3. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want everything that's a child of level 3. You can imagine there being like an entire tree of children under this level 3 component. And I want to be able to access state from level 3 in any of those children. There might be just two, like in this case, there might be a dozen, there might be 100, right? And it doesn't really matter how many there are. As long as I create a context in level 3, I can access it anywhere in that entire subtree for that component, as long as we do the setup that we're about to do together. So that's pretty awesome. So let's take a look at how this works. So first we're going to create context, right? So that's what we're doing right now. Create a context with create context. It's going to give us back an object, and let's use this example here, an auth context for authentication, for example. Now, and I'll mention some places where this might be useful, practically speaking. So I'm going to say import. I'm going to say create context from React. Okay, so this comes as a function that comes from React, just like useState and useReducer and all those other functions. And we're not going to use this as a hook. This is not a hook. Okay, this is going to give us back an object that actually has a couple of components inside of it. All right, so I'm going to say const. I'm going to name this with capital letters, just so it's a bit more obvious that this isn't like just like a regular variable. It's just convention. So I'll just go with what I have in the slides, which is an auth context. And this is going to create context, and I'm just going to call it like that with no arguments. Now, you can give it some default arguments, and there are some cases where that's useful, but by default, I'm just going to provide nothing right here, and we'll see kind of the most base use case, which is the most common use case as well. If you're interested to see what this argument is in here and how it differs, you can look at documentation for React, and we might see some places where that's useful, but most of the time we're going to be passing in a value quite explicitly, which I'll show you shortly. So there we go. That's step 1. Auth context, create context, and we get back this auth context object. Okay, so let's save that. And where we can see actually we get some nice typing here from React. So this is a React context object. I won't log this out for now because we're actually going to only use one thing out of here, which is the thing that we're interested in, and I'll show you what that looks like shortly. So we have step 1 done. Step 2, we want to create our values or state, which we'll see later, which we want to share with this entire subtree. So what I did in this case is I just created a object that has like a user ID property and a logged in property. It doesn't really matter what's in there. This is just stuff that you want to share with your application specifically. So this might be like a theme, in this case, authentication, or some other values that are important for this entire subtree of components to get. Maybe you fetched it from an API or something like that. So we'll go with an auth state in here. So I'll create that right below here. I'm not going to create it inside the component. I'm going to create it outside the component just like this. I'm going to say const auth state is equal to, and I'll say user ID. This will be 1, 2, 3. And then I'll say logged in, and that's going to be true. Okay, cool. So step 2 done. Step 1, create a context. Gives an object. Step 2, just create whatever state. This doesn't have to be an object, right? It can be an array. It could just be a single number or a string, whatever. It doesn't matter. Anything that you want to share. Now, an object is just useful because we can put arrays in there, objects in there. We can nest it, and we can do JSON on it and all that kind of fun stuff as well. So step 2 is done. So there we go. So step 1, step 2, that's our state. And really quick, before I go to step 3, I just want to kind of recap what this is doing for us, just so it's really clear. We'll see it shortly, but just mentally prepare ourselves for what's happening. I want to be able to share this object, okay, with level 2 and level 1 in this case. Traditionally, what I would have to do is I would have to, like for example, if I do this in here and I say, let me just move this down a little bit. Probably should have actually done this ahead of time, but it's okay. I'm going to do that. This is all very, very ugly looking. I'll copy that over here. And imagine I want to put my level 2 in here. So I'm going to import that level 2. Oops, level 2 from /level2.jsx. I'm going to have the extension there. And to put that in here, what I would do is I would just type level 2 just like that, right? And now I can render level 2 inside of level 3 using component composition. I can do the same for level 1 inside level 2, or I can just put level 1 directly in here. But I'm going to actually nest it a bit further down. So if I wanted to pass this auth state to level 2, right, with our current knowledge, what I would have to do is I'd probably have to pass it in as a prop. I'd say like auth state is equal to auth state. And this would work, which kind of makes sense, but it's a bit weird because this is kind of like not really in the component. This is like what I said not to do, which is put it outside the component scope. So what's the behavior of this? How is it going to work? Is it going to break, right? So we kind of want to achieve this, but also better than this, because if I do just this, then I have to do this every single place where I want to pass it in as a prop, right? For this entire subtree. Imagine I had like 10 of these in here. I would have to do this like 10 times. And if each of those had children and I wanted to pass those further down into their trees, I would have to do the same there, which would get quite disastrous pretty quickly, as you can imagine. So we don't want to do that. We want a way to just nicely, wouldn't it be nice if I could just do this, just like this, and then inside of level 2, I could just kind of like, have auth context just available to me like that without having to just pass it in as props everywhere, right? That's kind of what we're trying to achieve with useContext. So let's see if we can get that working. So let's switch back to step 3 here, which is creating our provider. So now we want to create a context provider and pass in the values that we want to pass down to our subtrees to that context provider using the value prop. So these 2 steps we already did right here. The new step here is on the bottom, and we're going to grab a property on the auth context object, which is the provider property with a capital P, and that's a React component. Okay, this component is not to be confused with the actual value, which is different. I remember when I first learned React context, I accidentally thought, maybe just my brain works this way, that the context provider is a thing that is like storing the data. It's not storing the data at all. The only place the data is being stored is in this value prop, which is pointing to this object right here. The context provider, its sole job is to kind of do some of the plumbing behind the scenes to pass these props through invisibly, basically automatically for us, as well as to create context boundaries. So if we have multiple contexts in our applications, the context hook knows where to go to get which context. Okay, so without going too deep down that rabbit hole, we'll just start with this. We know that provider is going to be a React component. So we can use it just like this, right? It's just a component. And I'm passing it as a children prop to this component, my children, my app in this case. In this case, I'm going to pass in level 3, but this would be whatever you want to be using that context. Okay. So what we have to do is provide that provider component a prop called a value that it's going to use to as its state value for that context. Okay, and that is where things are being stored. So it's going to be this auth state that's actually storing that data, and this context provider is just providing the boundaries, no pun intended, for what that context looks like. So let's see how this works, because yapping a lot doesn't really help unless you actually see an example. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to say that I want to make my level 3 component a provider. I want to make it the kind of root for this context. So any children of level 3 will have access to consume, which is the opposite of provide, the context. So how's this going to work? Well, I'm going to come up here. Technically, I could probably put it in here, but I'll just do it inside the fragment here. I'm going to say auth context. And if I do dot, I'm going to get a property on it. You can see that we have some properties on there. The one that we're interested in is the provider. I'll close that off. And what I'll do is I'll move these inside of here. So it looks like this. I'm going to return the auth context provider. And in there, it's going to have my children. This doesn't really need to be here. I could probably put it out here because this H1's not actually using this context. It doesn't really matter too much. So I could probably put it here just so you can see some differences as to how that works. We're not actually using auth states in our H1, so it doesn't actually matter. And actually, we can't access it directly inside this component anyways. It's only for the children through the children prop, which is kind of beyond what we need to know for right now, because the main thing that we're interested in is actually grabbing it from level 2. So we only did half of this step. We only created the boundary, which is the provider. There is no state in this whatsoever, right? Auth state is not in this auth context at all. It has no idea about auth state, which kind of makes sense. Why would it, right? When I created the create context up here, it doesn't have anything. That's actually where that default argument technically comes in, but we're going to ignore that for now and do it very explicitly. So we're going to pass in a value, and I'm going to say I want the context for this subtree, for this provider and any consumers of this provider, which is anything in here or its children, to be the auth state value, which is this object right here. So what I'm saying to React is please create a special boundary in this tree where any child of this auth context provider is going to magically have access to auth state. Okay, the actual object auth state, right? Like literally this object right here. Okay, so I'm going to save that. And we're pretty close to being done here. So we set up all the context and all that's being done. Now the last step is to actually use that context, right? And surprise, surprise, the name of that hook is called useContext, the title of this video. So we're going to consume or use this context in the child component using this useContext hook. And this can be any child component in the subtree for this provider. So the way that this looks is we're going to import useContext from React, which is that hook. We also need to import our actual context. So we should be exporting it from, in this case, our level 3 component. And in our child, what we can do is use context, give it the context object, and we're magically going to have access to literally that object. In this case, the auth state. And if I was to log that out, I would get back that value. And this can be any child. Notice that there is no props here that we're using explicitly. This is all being handled by React behind the scenes. So let's see how this works. So if I come back in here, I'm going to set up my level 2 component here. And the level 2 component, I'm also going to render out a level 1 component in here. So I'll do this, and then I'll do this. I'm going to do some moving around here, and I'll do this, and I'll move this up here. So there we go, level 2. And I'm going to put my level 1 in here. So I'm going to import level 1. So I'll say level 1 from level 1 dot, oops, what am I doing? What's going on? There we go. Level 1 dot JSX, or sorry, level 1. See, I'm getting confused. It's going 3, 2, 1 or 1, 2, 3. I knew that would bite me. So here I'm going to put my level 1 component, just like that. So this is going to render out level 2 and then level 1. And then inside level 1 is just going to show level 1, which is the h3 tag. Now what I'll do is I'll actually put some space in here so I can actually render out some other stuff, which we're going to use just so that we can see what that looks like. Probably should have set this up differently like that, but there we go. So that's level 1. And now I can access the context all the way through this tree. So just to recap, we have level 3, which is the parent, okay? And actually what I'll do before I explain this is I'll put this into main just so that we don't get confused. So I'm gonna, I only need level 3 in here, level 3 from level 3.jsx, and I'm gonna replace my app with my level 3, and I'll save that and I'll switch to my Chrome, and you'll see that we have level 3, level 2, level 1. Okay, so this is the parent. This is the kind of, grandparent, I guess. This is the parent, level 2, and this is the child. Okay. So if we go to level 3, which is the first thing that's going to get rendered out, we're going to create a context, and we're going to create a state or a value to share with that context. Then we're going to create a provider using that context that's going to wrap everything that's going to need that context in that entire subtree. In this case, it's going to be level 2, but level 2 has subcomponents inside of it, in this case level 1. So we also need to provide it that value, which is going to be our auth state. So the context is the boundary object, and then the value is the actual object that gets passed in a state. If I look at level 2, all I'm doing is importing level 1. There's nothing special happening here, nothing at all. In fact, we're probably going to ignore this component for now. If I go to level 1, nothing is happening in here. But now what we can do, check this out. I'm going to say import useContext from React. Okay. I also need to know which context I'm using when it comes to the object. So I actually have to go up to level 3, and I'm going to export. I need to export auth context to tell it that I'm using the auth context. That's the boundary that I'm looking for. So I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to say export, and I'll do a named export because we can only have one default export. Export auth context, just like that. Okay, and now I can grab this in any other file. So I'll go to level 1, again, skipping level 2, and I'll say auth, I'll grab my auth context, import auth context from level 3.jsx, which I just exported. Okay, now I use that context, pass it the context object. So I'm going to say const, I'll say auth context is equal to useContext, which is the hook to consume a context from a parent provider. Okay, and I'm going to provide it that context that I'm looking for. So this is going to look for the auth context up in the tree upwards. It's going to hunt through level 2. It's not going to see a context there. That's auth context. It's going to look through level 3, and here it is. It's right here, auth context. It found it. It's going to grab its value, and it's going to give it back to me in auth context, all without having to pass down any props. Okay, I'm going to go through that flow one more time because it's so important. This is the entire point of useContext. We are saying, please consume a context called auth context inside of this component, which is a child, which means that I know that there is a provider context somewhere in the magical cloud of components above me. So above me, I know in this case that there's level 2, right? But there's no auth context here. So I'm going to see, is there a parent of level 2? Yeah, there's level 3. And look at that, we have auth context right here. So I'm going to say, okay, I need the value for that context, or the default value, which we didn't pass here, if that doesn't exist. So the value is auth state, which is this object. So React is going to literally grab this object and give it to us as the return value in auth context. So if I say console.log of auth context, let's see what we get. If I switch back to Chrome, you can see that we get that context object from level 1.jsx. Okay, I'm going to zoom in on that so you can see. This is coming from level 1, right? We reached through level 2, reached up to level 3, and grabbed it from level 3, this exact object inside level 3's scope. So that's pretty cool. Now, that's it. That's how context works, right? Like that's literally exactly what is going to happen. Now I want to show you something kind of interesting, which is kind of unexpected. And this is the part that gets kind of confusing if you don't get practice with this, and we'll get more practice with this in the exercise videos together. Just context by itself is not stateful in the way that we think of state in something like React. So it doesn't react to re-renders by default. It just provides us a place to store data, which is exactly what we want. We want it to be general. However, we can give it state, manage data, in order for it to actually re-render components, but by default, it's not going to do that. It's just an object. If you think of this context, it's literally a vanilla JavaScript object. There's no useState, there's no useReducer, so there's no re-rendering happening here when that context changes. Okay, so I'll show you what I mean by that. So if I come up to if I come up here and I say let's do a button, so I'll say a button, and I'll say add to context, and I'll say on click equals add. I'll just create a function called add. I'll call it a function. I'll call this function add, and I will say auth context, which is an object. Okay, and I'll say at, and I'll just create a value. I'll just say add is equal to 1, 2, 3. Okay, I'm going to add a new key to the auth context object, and it's going to be the value 1, 2, 3. Right, so we would expect to see another value here. Besides user ID and logged in, it would be this add value. Okay. Then I want to, what I'll do here is I will do my fun little hack. I'll actually put a paragraph tag here, and inside here I'll do JSON, just so we don't have to keep looking at the console.stringify. So I encourage you to kind of, use this hack whenever you can, if you want to visualize stuff without having to always look through the console and your components. It's pretty useful once in a while, like in this case. We're going to say auth context, and we want to space it out by 2, and null is the second argument to stringify here. Okay, so that's going to let us see that right here, just like we would in the console. Then what I'm going to say is I want to see if I click on this button. Right? If I click on this add to context button, that is going to add a new key to this object, right? Which is basically this object right here, right? Is it going to re-render this DOM to show us in our p tag that new object? What do you think? Okay, I'll switch back to Chrome, refresh the page just to make sure everything's loaded. And I expect to see the add key being added here if it's being re-rendered. I'll click add to context, nothing happened. Nothing happened, right? No matter how many times I click it, nothing's gonna happen. So how do I know for sure that this is actually in there? Well, what I'll do is I'll do a console.log, and we'll see a version of this that's a bit easier to understand later of my auth context. I wanna make sure that's actually being added. Right, I want to make sure that I'm actually that it's being changed and didn't like mess up the spelling or something, right? So if I refresh this page and I click on add to context, we can see it is in there, right? It's definitely in there, and adding it multiple times doesn't do anything because it's the same name. So it's just going to keep overriding that key and value pair. But it's not being displayed here, but in memory, it is a different object. So this actually is very similar, if you think about it, to the useReference hook, the useRef hook. We have a reference in any of our child components to this context. And in this case, this context right here, this value, right? This object in memory in this case, or it could be an array or an array of objects or an object with arrays in it. Doesn't really matter, however your structure is. By default, it's not stateful in the context of React. Okay, I'm using context and state so similarly here. Hopefully it doesn't get confusing. But I'm changing this object, right? I'm changing it. I'm manipulating it, but it's not re-rendering the component. Okay, now I'll show you how we can actually do that. And in this case, you're probably thinking, well, we're changing it in place. Is that really gonna cause a change? I assigned it as a const just because that's best practice, but it's just not gonna change, right? Having a context out like this without a state or a use reducer is not gonna change it, and I'll show you why in a second. So we have a safe place to change values if we need and still share it with our entire React tree. And it can be stateful, which I'll show you, or it can not be stateful, just a place to store stuff, just like this, okay, in memory. So let me switch back to the slides and I'll show you really a visual for how we can understand this. So if you think of a React tree, let's think of this tree right here. So let's say I have app, and an app has 3 children, blog, home, and about, and each of those has a few children itself, right? Section components. And these are all different components, okay? What we would probably do maybe is like, let's say we have something to share with all of these components. We could pass them as props. That would work just fine. What we could also do is create a context and pass it down that way. So what does that actually look like? It looks like this, right? First, we can, if we want, not first, but like if we want, we can access it in blog, home, and about. If we do a useContext and it's being set up as a provider and app, but we can also access it anywhere here, right? Without passing it as props anywhere. And this is kind of awesome, but also quite complicated if you think about it, right? We could have hundreds of children here. These could have their own children. They could have their own children. It could be at the root of our application, and their app has like, 100 components in total, and we could access this context anywhere that we want. Okay, so that's definitely a way to use it. Another way to use it is like this. I could create a context out here just for blog. Okay, it doesn't really matter. It only matters where we create the context and where that provider is. And we can have multiple contexts, which I'll show you in a second. But if I created this context for blog, we would have access to that only in these 2 section components down here. These home and about and their sections would not have access to that context. Okay, if we had multiple contexts, it would look like this, right? So let's say I kept that context just for blog, and I had one at the root in app. Now, everything in blog and these sections would have access to context. These 2 sections would have access to blog's context and app's context. Everything else would just have access to everything else here would just have access to app's context, because blog's context is independent to everything that's a child of blog in this case, assuming that it's a provider. Okay, so how a lot of kind of libraries and your own code might work is you'll have different contexts sprinkled out throughout your code or throughout your components in React. And what you want to generally do is keep it as close to the children that need it as possible and not any higher up. A lot of the time, this context is stateful, which I'll show you next, and re-rendering a parent component, as we saw in useState and useReducer and our useEffects, is going to re-render that entire subtree. So if we have a state inside of app, for example, and that state changes, this entire set of children are going to re-render, okay, no matter what. So all these children are going to re-render if app state changes. Now, that could become a big performance problem if it's a very large application, like hundreds of components. Maybe what we want instead is that state only needs to be for a certain component. Like maybe it's only the nav bar, maybe it's only the footer, or maybe it's only like a certain page or something like that, right? Then we can keep that over here, and only that subtree will re-render and everything else can remain unaffected. Okay. Now, I don't want to get too deep into the optimization stuff because a lot of time what you will see is it is being inserted right at the root of the application. So just you don't have to think about it, and every single child has access to that state, especially if it's stateful. But you do want to, at the back of your mind, if you're running into performance issues, optimize that and maybe try to lower it to places that do need it if possible. Okay. So I was teasing this entire time that this is possible to use in conjunction with useState or something like useReducer. We saw that changing this state doesn't actually re-render any of these children components. Now, it is possible to make this stateful. So what do I mean by that? Well, we can make context stateful by passing in values that are tied to the state. And when I mean state, I mean useState or useReducer in that parent components that's being the provider. And the important thing to remember, again, as I hinted at in the previous slide, is that the same rendering rules apply from the hook being used. So if we're using useState or useReducer, if that state changes, every single thing in that subtree is going to re-render no matter what. So we have to be very careful. With great power comes great responsibility. We want to make sure that if we have hundreds of components and not all those 100 need that thing, we want to put that state as low as possible so that we don't have unnecessary re-renders affecting the performance of our application. Now, when you're making smaller or even medium-sized applications, it doesn't matter too much, but as kind of the size of your application grows or you have multiple people working on a project, you want to be a bit more careful with where you put these things and just try to think of where it's going to be used and how it's going to be used. And it's totally okay to have multiple use contexts and context providers throughout your app, depending on where they're actually used. And that's actually how a lot of the production libraries, like routers and things like that, are used behind the scenes. So let me show you a demo of this to wrap up this video. So I'm going to come up to level 3 here. And let's say that I wanted to make it so that this state here is stateful, right? So such that if I was to change it, it would actually update correctly in the DOM, right? So like this would actually change. Well, we know we need state for that because that's what useState does. So I'm going to import useState. And this is going to be in the parent that is providing the context because we have to pass in a value that is stateful. So right now, this is not stateful. There's no useState or useReducer for this. This is outside the context of the component and outside the scope. And it's not going to cause re-renders if it gets changed. So we know I'll use useState in this demo, but we can also do this with useReducer, and we'll see that in the exercises. I'm going to say auth state, or I'll just say, yeah, I guess I'll say, this gets a bit confusing, but I'll do auth state, and I'll say set auth state, and this will be use state, and we're going to use our auth state. Now, I'm hesitant to this. I kind of want to change this value because this is going to shadow this value because of the scope. So maybe I'll just say auth state, let's just say initial. Okay, I'll rename this. And this is going to be auth state initial. Just so we don't get confused with the naming, even though that would have still worked. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm setting a state value. Okay, I'm setting a state value just like any other state. This is no different from the regular useState hook. And I'm saying, hey, React, for level 3, I want a state, and it's going to be this object, which is this one right here. Okay, I could have just passed it in line as well. And I want it to be called auth state, and I want to access the changing state method, which is going to be set auth state in this case. And if I use that to change the state, I want you to give me a new auth state and re-render everything in this component. Okay, so let's see how that works. So I'm going to save that. And now I also want to be able to pass the value to change that state to the child. So if you think about it right now, I'm passing only the state value, auth state. I'm passing that down here, and I can grab that, and I'll rename this in a second, from useContext. But the problem is that this is just the value. Okay, so if I come back here and I reload the page, you can see that this is just the value, and the behavior is the same. This is an in-place modification of a useState object, But since I'm not using setState to actually change this object, I'm not getting the re-render, behaving very similar to what we just saw earlier. If that's confusing to you, definitely check out the useState hook video. We go through an example just like this. So I need to be able to, instead of doing this right here on line 9, I want to be able to like set that state to that new value. Okay, because this is an in-place modification which is not being picked up by React. So if I come up to level 3 here, I'm also going to pass in set auth state. But now, how do I pass in 2 values? Can I just do auth state and then like set auth state? Can I do that? I can't really do that. I can only pass in 1 value. So what you'll sometimes see is you'll pass in an object, or you might pass in an array like this. I'm just going to pass in an array just so that it's very similar to this hook right here, just so it's a bit more clear. There's some optimizations that we can do with things like use callback and memo and all that kind of stuff, but I'm not going to go there because I want to keep things super simple. So in this case, I'm passing in an array which has 2 values, the actual handle to the state, which is this one right here, but actually in the context of level 3, it's going to be recreated, and then the function to change that state from any child of level 3, no matter how many levels deep, and no matter how many children. I could have 1,000 children, and any of them can use the useContext hook to get access to this array with these 2 values if we want. So let's do exactly that. I'm going to grab those out of level 1. I'm going to do some renaming here. So now our context is not going to be that value. So if I come back here, what we'll see is I get back the actual object and I get back the function. Okay, you can see the first thing in that array is the object, which is the state, and the second thing is just a function to change that state. Okay, so I'm going to treat it just like the useState hook. I'm going to say this is the auth state and this is the set auth state. You could name these whatever you want. It doesn't actually matter. Okay, we're just going to get back these 2 values, but the place of these values matter. The first thing is going to be the state. The second thing is going to be the setter, which is how we pass it in right over here. Okay, I should probably scroll up a little bit so you can see that. So I pass in value of auth state first, set auth state here, and then over here I have pulling those out from the context over here. And notice that the context is the same. That didn't change. We're still passing it through the context. And now if I do auth state and set auth state instead, what we'll see, I'll just get rid of this console log and I will stringify. For now, I'll just do auth state so that we actually don't get an error. And I'll refresh this page. And what we'll see is that we have those two values. We have the dispatch set state, which is a fancy looking function that we get back from React. And we get that object as well, okay, which is that user ID and the logged in. Now, this is the problematic code right here. We want to change that. I'll comment that out as well. We want to change this to be set auth state. And I want to be able to grab everything in the previous auth state and maybe add this add property to it. There's a few ways we can do that. I'm going to use this method right here, which is I'm going to grab the previous state and I'm going to say spread out everything in the previous state and then add the add property of 1, 2, 3. Okay, and this is going to return as, I guess, let me do this way just so it's a bit more clear what's happening. Return that. Always mix up the brackets. There we go. So I'm going to pass in an arrow function, and that arrow function, I didn't want to do inline, so because there would be too many brackets. So we're going to return an object, right? This is using the set state function method instead of just passing in the object directly. And we're going to get access to the previous state. I'm going to spread that out, which is going to be all the values that were in there before, which is going to be these 2 values. And I'm going to then add the add key with the value of 1, 2, 3. All right. And what this is going to do is this setter function is going to trigger this object here, auth state, to change in level 3. And that is going to trigger a re-render of level 3, which is going to trigger a re-render of everything here, including level 2, which is a child. level 2 is going to re-render with level 1 re-rendering. Level 1 is going to re-render. And look at that, in level 1, we're going to have auth state. We're going to get that new updated value, and that should show up in our string. So if I come in here and I reload the page, what we'll see is I click on add to context, and I want to see add showing up right here. And I click on add to context, and look at that. It actually does re-render, and we see that value actually showing up inside the DOM. And you can see that it actually shows up here as well. Okay, and this is coming from just re-rendering the level 1 component, the log in there on line 6, which is basically on a use effect that runs every single re-render no matter what. So that proves that level 1 is re-rendering because we're seeing that log, which happens only when level 1 is executed, which is when it's re-rendering. So what we're seeing here is when I click on add, you're going to see all these re-renders always happening, but we're going to see add show up here. I'll show you that one more time. Add is not there by default. I click on add to context, it shows up, and then level 1 does actually re-render. And I'll show you what happens to level 2 here. If I put a console log here, normally you'd want to put this in a use effect, but this is the same thing as putting a use effect with no dependencies, almost the same thing. I'll say level 2 is re-rendering. And I'll also put a level 3 is re-rendering, why not? We know that this is going to log when auth state changes. Level 3 is re-rendering. And in level 1, I'll just say level 1 rendering. Just like that. And I'll keep those logs in there for the state and stuff. So I'll refresh this page. We're going to see level 3 re-rendering, level 2 re-rendering, level 1 re-rendering. So that's when it first mounts. I'm going to click on add to context. That's going to, let's just watch this flow really quick so that we know exactly what's happening. When I click on add to context, I'm going to level 1. That is going to call the on click for this button, which is the add function, which is in level 1, which is this function right here. We're going to trigger this function, which is going to call set auth state. It's going to set it to be this value, which is the previous state, which is our initial state with those 2 keys and values with a 3rd key and value in here, the add and 1, 2, 3. That's going to send that off. React is going to grab it. It's going to change this auth state in level 3. Level 3 is going to grab that, re-render. It's going to re-render level 2 because that's part of the children of level 3. It's going to re-render level 2. Level 2 is going to re-render. Level 1's in here. Level 1's going to re-render. We're going to come back and we're going to re-render this. There's no more kind of composed children in here beyond the base DOM elements. So then we're done. And we will grab that new auth state right here and actually have it visible inside this p tag. Or if we're mapping over it and creating components, for example, those would have access to the updated auth state value. So let's see that work. I'm going to click this. I expect to see that show up here and then all the re-rendering to cascade down over here. So I click on that and we can see indeed it does show up here. We have add right over there, and then we can see level 3 is re-rendering, level 2 is re-rendering, and level 1 is re-rendering, and we get that new value in there correctly just as we expect. So that wraps up useContext. Isn't that super awesome? Like what we just saw is this allows us to pass in values and share them with an unlimited number of children anywhere in our tree of React that we want, right? And the visual is probably something like this, right? Hopefully a little bit cleaner than this, is a bit messy, but hopefully that visual helps a little bit, right? We can pass that value in without having to explicitly pass it in as a prop to any of the children, which is amazing because if we have hundreds of components as children, all we need to do is create that provider, pass it in a value, which can be stateful or not stateful. And then in that child, anywhere in that tree, we just use that context and we have access to whatever values that we passed in whatever format that was, whether it's stateful or not stateful. If it was stateful, it will do all the stateful things that we expect in React, which is the whole cascading re-render of that entire tree. Hopefully you found this video valuable. I know that was a lot. This actually wraps together a whole bunch of different hooks that we've seen together, but thankfully it is the last major hook that we're going to be learning together beyond maybe some custom hooks as well. So I hope you found this video valuable. If you did, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know in the comments what you thought of this and if you have been using it this way or if this helped in your actual applications. If you want to support the channel, I have a Patreon set up in the description below, as well as YouTube memberships if you want to go through there, or super thanks. I'd love it if you could do that. And in the next video, what we're going to do is go over a bunch of exercises to get a lot of practice with this idea of useContext, with all these different versions where we can see it with state, we can see it with reducer as well, which is just another abstraction on top of state, which we saw in the previous video, and how that really allows us to do things like even create our mini state management kind of framework and do things like routing in the future, or in this case, sharing authentication state or theme state, and the effect that that has on the entire subtree of that component. So I can't wait to get to those exercises. I will see you in those ones. See you later.